Hello, my name is David Pennington and I'm the Superintendent of the Ponca City Public Schools. Last night, Thursday, April 18th, we had a meeting with Ponca City parents in the Ponca City High School Hall Auditorium to talk about the formation of a K-County Parent Legislative Action Committee. Last year in the Tulsa area, the first Parent Legislative Action Committee was formed in the state of Oklahoma. And this organization has spread across eastern Oklahoma and now has branches in Oklahoma, Cleveland, and Canadian counties. The purpose of this group is to involve parents in legislation that deals with education. Primarily, that group has focused on three things. They focused on returning local control to locally elected school boards, the issue of testing, what testing is used for, and how many tests are given to students, and the third issue is funding for public schools. Our hope was last night to talk about the PLEC, to talk to parents about funding in Oklahoma, and then to get a group of parents to commit to attend a meeting that's going to be in Oklahoma City this upcoming Tuesday, April the 23rd. We had a great turnout last night, and we have a group of parents who have agreed to go to Oklahoma City. My hope is that that group then will come back and between now and next school year form an organization, and then when the next school year starts we can have a group of parents in Ponca City who are involved in the legislative process, hopefully all of K-County. After the meeting was over last night, I had a parent ask me if we had filmed last night's session, and we had not. So today I'm going to make that presentation, which will then be posted on Channel 19 and on our Facebook page and on our website. So thank you for turning in, and now we're going to talk about Oklahoma school finance. Oklahoma school finance is always a difficult issue to talk about because it's very complicated. Hopefully this will be something that will be easy to follow and easy to understand. Obviously, if there's any questions you have after you view this, feel free to call the Board of Education. Our number is 580-767-8000, and either we can talk on the phone, or if you want to stop by, and I'll be more than glad to go over what we talked about in this presentation. So thank you for being here. The first slide we look at is a slide that has to do with the basics of Oklahoma school finance, and what this chart shows you is the general fund money that comes to the Ponca City Public Schools. School districts have three pots of money that they derive revenue from. The biggest pot of money is general fund, and that's the dollars we use to operate our schools on a day-to-day basis. Those are the dollars that we use to pay for salaries, and the dollars we use to pay the light bill, and the dollars we use to pay for gasoline for buses. And you can see by this chart that last year for us it was $35 million. You can see the different sources that revenue come to us from. The largest source of revenue is state money, and that is generally a combination of state aid appropriation, which is general fund money, and then we have some specific dollars. We get specific money for professional development, money for reading sufficient, and other programs that as a district we have no control where that money goes. It has to be spent for specific purposes. Down underneath that you'll see current enrollment and weighted ADM. There are three ways that money comes to us as a school district. Either by average daily attendance, which is the average number of students that are in school on a given day, average daily membership, which is the number of students that are enrolled in school, and then the final one is weighted ADM. Weighted ADM is the way that we drive money to school districts through the school funding formula in Oklahoma. What is weighted ADM? Well, that's student enrollment, and then we have weights that are added to students. For example, a first grade student is a weight of 1.2. If that first grade student is gifted, they have another 0.6 added to their weight. So that one student, for funding formula purposes, is worth 1.8. And so you take those weights. The grade weights are different. They're not the same for every student. Then you add in the other weights, which could be free and reduced lunch is a weight, gifted is a weight. If they are transported to and from school, there's a weight associated with that. and then there are weights for special education students. And so all those things are combined together, and when you look at that, the enrollment, or the weighted ADM for Ponca City schools, goes from an ADM of 5,251 students to a weighted ADM of 8,130 students. The next slide shows you where our revenue comes from. And you can look and see that the majority of our revenue, 54%, is state dollars. The next biggest chunk is local ad valorem taxes, and then the third largest pot of money is federal dollars. And that's pretty consistent for schools across the state. Those are always going to be the three largest sources of revenue. The size of the pie is different. A school that had lots of local revenue, their blue section would be bigger. The district that's closest to us would be Frontier, which, because of the small number of students they have, but the large tax base they have because of the power plant, they get very little state money because they're able to raise more money locally. In Oklahoma, we have an equalized school funding formula, and basically the way that works is that the state determines how much money should be spent per child, and so if you have $100 that each child should have, if you can raise $50 of that locally, then you get $50 from the state. If you can raise $20 locally, then you get $80 from the state. And so that all goes in together, and that's what we call the school funding formula. The next slide shows you per pupil expenditures over the 10-year time period from 1999 to 2009. And it shows you a regional average, a national average, and a state average. And what this chart shows you is that Oklahoma is well below the region and well below the nation. You can look and see that there was some time in there where we had a growth in state revenue and a little bit, and we kind of closed the gap between the region. But when we got to 2009, that gap had widened. The gap was wider in 2009 than it was in 2000. So today we receive $1,600 less per student than the regional average, and $3,000, almost $3,000 less per student than the national average. So what is the regional average? If you look at this chart, this shows you who's in Oklahoma's region. This region is assigned to us by the National Center of Educational Statistics. That is the Department of Education, and they have the country grouped in regions. Our region includes Arkansas, Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, New Mexico, and Texas. What you can see is not only are we below the regional average, but we pull the regional average down. If Oklahoma was not in this region, regional spending would be higher. The state that we're closest to is Texas, and we are about $800 less per child in what we spend than what they spend in Texas. If you went 27 miles north and crossed the Kansas line, you would have $3,000 more per year spent on your child's education. I think that most of us have traveled in these states, and I don't, from my perspective, it's just hard for me to imagine that we can't do as well in what we spend on our schools as Arkansas, New Mexico, Texas, and I would even throw Kansas and Missouri into that mix. One of the things you hear a lot about funding in Oklahoma, and especially when some of the politicians across the state are talking about how we fund services, how do we fund education, how do we fund Department of Human Services, how do we fund prisons. One of the things we're consistent, or state employees, what the wages state employees earn. We're told that it's less expensive to live in Oklahoma, and so we don't have to pay our employees as much. We don't have to spend as much to operate our schools or operate the Department of Human Services or to operate our colleges, because the cost of living is less. This next chart shows you the cost of living index for urban areas in our region. And so what you see is that there's not a dramatic difference. Tulsa is the lowest. They're 8 percentage points less than Little Rock, Arkansas. If you look at that chart, you'll probably be a little surprised that Little Rock, Arkansas has a higher cost of living than Colorado Springs or Dallas. But the reality is that the cost of living in those states, in these cities compared to Oklahoma, is not a dramatic enough difference to justify $1,600 less per student in state funding for our schools. It's really hard to justify when you look at Oklahoma City and Wichita, Kansas, where there's a 0.1% difference in what we expend on students, but there's a $3,000 less expenditure between the states. So what would happen to Ponca City if we were funded at either the regional average or the national average? If we were funded at the regional average, we would have almost $8 million more to spend in our school system this year. If we were at the national average, we'd have almost $14 million more dollars to spend. Now, you know, I've been in education for 37 years. I've been a superintendent now for 18. There was a time in my career where I was hopeful that we might get to the regional average. I don't think that will happen, unfortunately, at least in the life of my career. But I think we ought to strive to be better. Last year we had a group of parents who went to the Capitol, and their motto was 49th is not good enough. And that the fact that we were 49th in what we spend in our schools in this state was not good enough, that we ought to do better. And you know, it wouldn't, and again, I think if you go back, if you think about the last slides you saw, or 2 slides ago, where we look at the difference in spending, you know, it would be different to be last in the region if the difference in spending was $200 a student. But when the gap between us and the next lowest state is $800 per student, that we're over more than $1,000 different per student than what's spent in Arkansas and Missouri and Colorado and New Mexico, $3,000 less than Kansas. I think that we can do better, and we should do better for our children. The next slide shows you what's happened to enrollment since 2009, and what this shows you is since 2009 in the state of Oklahoma we've grown almost 34,000 students. So what we're facing right now is our funding is less today than it was in 2009, but yet that funding has to cover the education of more children. So we have more students and less money than we've had since 2009 in this state. How about revenue? If you look at the next slide, revenue, you can see that since 2009, local and county revenue has grown by $95 million. That's property taxes. That's the property taxes that you pay in the home. It's the property taxes that business industry pay. State dedicated revenue is up $16 million. Again, there are revenue streams in this state that the taxes collected go directly to school districts. There's a portion of the gross production tax that goes directly to schools. There is a portion of the tax that's paid on car tax. When you buy a car tag, a certain percentage of that money goes to the state and then is redistributed back to schools. There is the rural electric tax, goes to the school district that has, depending on the amount of rural electric power lines that run through your district. State appropriations are down $301 million, almost $302 million. You've heard a lot about the Great Recession, and you can see the effect that's had on Oklahoma revenue for school districts since 2009. Federal revenue is down $81 million. And I would point out to you that's less than what it was in 2009. It's not less than the highest year. In 2009, we had $581 million in federal revenue in Oklahoma for public schools. That grew to $776 million in 2010. That was the first wave of what was called ARA money or stimulus money. If you look at that, while there's been a lot of controversy about the federal spending, that $200 million additional federal dollars that we received in 2010 and 2011 saved Oklahoma schools. And it prevented us from having to gut programs, increase class sizes, and to do some very drastic things in this state. Overall, when you look at overall revenue from Oklahoma schools, local, state, federal dollars, we have $272 million less to operate our schools on today than we had in 2009. The next slide shows you the percentage change in spending per student adjusted for inflation between 2008 and 2013. And what this shows you is that Oklahoma has had the 3rd largest cut in the country in what we spend on our children. The only 2 states we trail are Arizona and Alabama. And you can look at this list, and again, this is reflective of the recession. And it shows you that many states had to cut spending because revenues were down. But what you'll also see is that those cuts were not the same across the board. Some of that has to do with the way schools are funded. Some schools receive more property taxes than state taxes, and so property taxes have a tendency, when the economy drops, property values generally, if they do drop, it's a longer process. They don't drop immediately, like income tax collections, corporate income tax collections, so that you have a little bit of a cushion or you're not hit as hard. The next page shows you that not every state cut spending to schools, that despite these very difficult economic times throughout the country, there are some states that found a way to increase funding for their schools. In some places it's very minimal, but you can see by this chart, in others it's pretty dramatic. The biggest increase has been in North Dakota. North Dakota is an outlier. They've had a very robust development in oil and natural gas in North Dakota, and they have a very small population. And so because they have such a small population, the revenue that they generate through oil and gas production goes further than the same amount of oil and gas production would go in Oklahoma. So what's happened to our district since 2008 and 2009 in the area of membership and revenue? Well, what you can see is we've grown 293 students. Just, you know, and you think about Ponca City and what we've been through with the transfer of another large segment of ConocoPhillips employees out of Ponca City, that despite that we've still grown. And we have 293 more students in our district today than we did 5 years ago. Unfortunately, our revenue is down $217 per student, an overall loss of almost $1.8 million. Now that's $1.8 million a year for the last 4 years. So we've lost almost $8 million in revenue since the recession has hit. One of the things that's being discussed at the Capitol this session and has received lots of discussion is a tax cut proposal. There are two proposals that are still alive. One is a proposal that's supported by the House and Governor Mary Fallin that would eliminate the highest tax bracket in Oklahoma. There's a Senate version that is a combination of lowering the tax rate but also eliminating some tax credits so that this is revenue neutral. One thing I would point out to you, that the difference is that the legislature can eliminate a tax credit this session. They can add that tax credit back next session, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now. With taxes, once you've lowered taxes in this state, it either takes a 75% vote of the legislature or vote of the people to increase those taxes. So as an entity that consumes state dollars, we're very concerned about revenue reductions. Remember, today we have $1.8 million less to spend on the education of children in Ponca City than we did 4 years ago. As a state, we have $271 million less to spend. What this chart shows you is who gets the money. I think it's always important whenever you hear about a tax cut to know exactly how are you going to benefit. And you look at this chart and you can see that 60% of the population in Oklahoma will receive a tax refund. Their tax cut will be, at the high end of that, will be $39 a year. So the most that 60% of our population can count on is getting $39 back in tax relief. The next biggest tax break is for those individuals who have an income of between $53,000 and $89,000 a year. And those people will receive a tax break of $83 a year. Again, less than $10 a month. The individuals that will receive the highest tax break from a dollar standpoint are those who make over $392,000 a year. And the average tax break for those individuals would be $1,800 a year. $1,800 is a lot of money. But again, if your income is over $392,000 a year, you know, I'm not sure that $1,800 is that important to you. You know, there are lots of individuals. There's a movement in this state to eliminate income taxes, and that may be good for state development. You know, I don't know that, but what I do know is this: is we have to have money to support state services. If we want to have state services, if we want to have quality public schools, we have to fund those schools. If we want to have prisons that are not overcrowded, we have to fund more beds. If we want our roads to be safe, we have to have highway patrolmen, and we have to pay those highway patrolmen. If we want families that struggle to have the help they need, then we have to have a well-funded Department of Human Services. This current tax cut will reduce revenue in the state by $160 million. The effect to schools has been estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood of a between $30 and $40 million loss of revenue for school districts. So if that's true, we're already down $271 million where we were in 2009. You're looking at a reduction in spending to schools of over $300 million compared to where we were 4 years ago. Obviously, everybody has to draw their own conclusions, but from my perspective, I would just as soon I'd just in the state keep my money and adequately fund the necessities that we have in Oklahoma. The next slide is a slide that shows you again a breakdown of that. It's a pie chart, and you can see that we're the top 20% income earners in Oklahoma get almost a little bit more than 60% of the tax revenue that is received. This next chart is a chart that is a review of state appropriations, and this is going to take a little bit of explanation. There are basically four sources of revenue for state appropriations for schools. The largest appropriation is the state aid general fund appropriation. And the way to think about that is when all the revenue is collected in the state of Oklahoma, that's general fund revenue. That's the revenue that people like me, school superintendents, along with college professors and DHS administrators and the director of corrections and everybody who receives state money, these are the dollars that we go and we, for lack of a better term, fight over. We try to make sure to protect the money we got the year before, and then we would like to have more money, either a percentage of the new money because of revenue growth, or sometimes have money taken away from one agency and given to us. We also have money in what is known as the 1017 fund, and those are tax revenue dollars that go into a specific account and can only be spent on education, on Common Ed. There is another fund of money, there's another pot over here, that is the money that comes from the lottery. That's somewhere between $25 and $35 million every year, and that money can only be spent on Common Ed. There's another pot of money called Technology Fund, and it's some money that is revenue that's raised from gross production taxes that is put into a special fund. That the original intent of that fund was to buy technology for schools. Because the fund's never generated enough money to do that, it's about $25 million a year. It goes into the general appropriation from school districts. And then we generally get $2 million a year, maybe a little more than that, from a mineral leasing fund. And I'm not sure what that is. I think it's probably money from coal and some other minerals that are mined in the state of Oklahoma. For those of you that are watching that were in Oklahoma in the early 90s, you may remember that in the early 90s, Governor Henry Bellman proposed an education reform bill that became known as House Bill 1017. And this piece of legislation contained some really important school reforms, and really Oklahoma became a leader for a number of years in reforming education. It's kind of hard to believe that 1017 happened 20 years ago, and maybe really 22 years ago. But what some of the reforms that were in place that you may be familiar with, one was class size limits. That's probably one of the ones that got the most attention, that we'd cap our class sizes at 20 at the elementary level, that secondary teachers on a 6-period day would only see 125 students a day, and teachers on a 7-period day would be limited to 140 students a day. That we would have counselors at every school, we would have librarians at every school. There was a provision that we teach a foreign language at the elementary level. And there was also a significant pay raise for teachers. And we created a new state minimum salary schedule, and we made a significant investment in teacher salaries in Oklahoma. To do that, the state passed specific tax increases for the purpose of funding the 1017 reforms. Those tax increases were an increase in the personal income tax, an increase in corporate income taxes, an increase in the state sales tax. There was also a little oil and gas money that went in there. And then when Governor Henry came into office and negotiated a compact with the tribes, a percentage of the money of the gaming revenue went into the 1017 fund. The idea behind all this was that in the past, the legislature in the 70s and 80s, the legislature had raised taxes for the purpose of funding schools, and the general population felt like that what the legislature did is they took that money to get taxes they'd raised, and it basically gave schools the same amount of money they had before, and they basically took the tax increase and spent on other things. Kind of the way to think about this is the idea behind 1017 is that here's a baseline number. It's a percentage of the state budget, of the state general fund appropriation that school districts get, that appropriation will continue, and then we'll have this 1017 money, which will be money that will increase school funding. And if you look at the chart, you can see that's pretty much what's happened. If you look at the baseline of 2007, and you could take this all the way back to 1993, you can look and see that we had state aid appropriation of $1.2 billion, had $511 million in 1017 money. The next year, state appropriations went up to $1,247 million. 1017 fund went up $648. So those two with the other dollars combined to raise revenue. You can also see when the recession starts, you can see that in 2009 there was a drop in 1017 money. The next year 1017 money went up, but we had a pretty significant drop in state revenue. We had another drop in state appropriated dollars in 2011. Also had a drop in 1017 funding. And I want to just stop for a minute. What's important about that is that when we have recessions and bad times in the state, common education gets hit twice. Because when revenue in Oklahoma drops, we take a cut. If the state has to cut appropriations 10%, then common schools will take a 10% cut. But if the 1017 fund also loses money, then we take a cut in 1017 dollars also. So we get hit in two areas. And since the 1017 fund is made up of what makes up the state appropriated fund, then we're typically going to take a kind of a double hit on that. I want to go up to 2012. And you'll see that in 2012 we had $1.1 billion of state appropriated revenue, along with $634 million of state of 1017 funding. This time last year, we were having a lot of discussion in Oklahoma about tax cuts, and what we were told is that they would guarantee that education would not have their funding cut, that they would protect Common Ed. Because one of the big concerns about a tax cut is how are you going to fund our schools. I want to make it very clear that in that discussion, what they meant when they said hold Common Ed harmless was that we're not worried about the fact that you've lost $270 million in revenue. We're not interested in raising your budget back to where it was. We're going to hold you harmless as to where you are right now, where you were in fiscal year 12, which would have been the 11-12 school year. But what this chart shows you is that the legislature and the governor's office made a conscious decision not to put more funding in the public schools of the state of Oklahoma. What this chart shows you is that they cut the general fund appropriation to school districts by $93 million. Now, the way they were able to do that is because the 1017 fund grew $91 million. Also, the technology fund grew $2 million. And so what the state did is they supplemented 1017 growth revenue for general fund appropriation. For those of you who are watching, and maybe you weren't here in Oklahoma in the 90s, let me tell you what happened with 1017. It was a very bitter fight in the legislature over funding over 1017. Not only the reforms, but the money, how we were going to fund the reform. The bill passed by a very narrow margin, signed into law by Governor Bellman, and very quickly an initiative petition was circulated in the state to overturn the decision made by the legislature. A vote was held. A state question was put on the ballot, and we had a vote, I think, in October of it was either 92 or 93. I'm not sure exactly the year. Been a lot of time passed since then. But in the largest turnout in state history for a single question, by the largest margin on a state question up until that time in state history, 1017 was affirmed by the voters of the state of Oklahoma. So 1017, the idea behind 1017, the reforms, the concept of locking in a level of state funding, the concept of additional funding that would go to schools based upon specific revenues, was not only approved by the vote by the legislature, but it was also affirmed by the people of the state of Oklahoma. I don't think you can look at these numbers and draw any other conclusion, is that the individuals in power in Oklahoma in 2000 in the spring of 2012 made a conscious decision to do something other than what the voters of Oklahoma had said they wanted done. You know, I think that's something that I know all of us in education, all of us who were teachers in the 90s, who went to the Capitol to lobby for these reforms and for this money, were very saddened when we saw what had happened. We should have, if the legislature would have acted as every legislature has acted since the inception of 1017, we should have more money in our schools today. The next slide shows you the 1017 as a percentage of state aid, and you can look and see that we were generally somewhere in the low 30s. That bumped up in 2012, and this last session, almost 40% of schools' funding was because of 1017 money. The next slide shows you what's happened to common education funding over the last 13 years. And you can see that if you go back in 2000, you use that as your baseline, that 36% of all state dollars, or of state appropriation, went to Common Ed. That's pre-K through 12th grade education. That got as high as 38% in fiscal year 4. And it dropped in 2006, bumped up again in 2008. Today we're at 34% of state appropriations. That's the lowest percentage of state appropriation since the passage of House Bill 1017. This is back where we were before the legislature and then the voters of the state made a commitment to tax themselves more to fund education in this state. The next slide shows you appropriations, and you can look and see what makes up the appropriation for the Department of Education. Financial support of public schools is state aid. You can look at that and see that our high year was fiscal year 09, where we had $2,035 million. For the last 2 years, that's been $1,816 million. A loss of a little bit more than $200 million in state funding. The next slide shows you revenue in the state. You know, I don't think anyone, as a school superintendent, I don't expect the legislature to give us money they don't have. We've all understood that we've been in tough financial times in this state. But our economy is rebounding, and that's great news. If you'll look, you can see that the highest year of revenue collections was in 2008, when we collected $5,953 million in this state. You can look and see that we had a drop in 9, a drop in 10. We started to rebound in 11. We rebounded a little bit more in 12, and then 13 and 14 have been better. Now you'll notice on 13 it says projection, and the reason for that is all the revenue for 2013 is not in yet. We're collecting that right now. So so you know, we may collect more revenue than we estimated, and that's typically what happens when the economy's better. And then fiscal year 14 is the estimate of what we think the state will have in revenue for 2014, which starts July 1st, 2013 through June 30th, 2014. And so what you'll see by that, if you look at that, our revenue is back to within less than $20 million of where it was in fiscal year 08. Our revenue projection, we're back to 96% of what we were in 2008. But our funding for common schools in this state is still 20% less than it was in 2009. It's hard to understand how state revenue has rebounded so much, but funding for common education has not. The next slide shows you state appropriations from 2006 to 2013, and you can see that our highest appropriated year was fiscal year 09. That actually included, it ended up being $7,125 million. $30 million of that money was federal stimulus dollars, or stabilization money. If you look at fiscal year 10 and fiscal year 11, you see two big yellow blocks of money, and that was money that came to the state of Oklahoma from the federal government to help it work its way through the Great Recession. And I know that there's lots of people who did not support stimulus money to the states, but what I can tell you is it made a significant difference to school districts. It was the difference between brutal cuts in staffing of our schools and what we've been able to do, which is basically, for most of us, maintain all school programs through some very, very, very difficult financial times. But what you'll see is that, again, if you look at fiscal year 13, we're within almost $200 million of where we were in fiscal year 9. So our revenue is coming back. So what does all this mean? Well, this is, I think, what's important as we think about funding for schools. Because we were level funded last year as a district, or for the last 2 years, and I want to first of all regress and say this. You know, we as a school district, we've known that we were in tough financial times. And so we've done the best job we can over the last 4 years to save as much money as we could, and to make sure we build up our fund balance just in case the economy did not grow fast enough to restore revenue to schools. And so last year we finished with a fund balance of $4.8 million, 14%. We knew last year, because of all the discussion about level funding, that we were not going to see an increase in revenue in Oklahoma schools. We made a conscious decision that we were going to dip into our fund balance to provide the same basic level of education, to provide the same programs, the same staffing as we did in 2012. We would have preferred to have grown our staff. We would have preferred to have hired some more teachers, and we did that in some cases. But we knew that we were going to have to be very conservative. As a result of that, our fund balance, we anticipate when this fiscal year is over on June 30th, that we will have a fund balance of $3 million. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more, but we don't know that right now. So we'll carry over 9%, and 9% is a good carryover. I've said, as I've been out talking to the schools about this, if you were to tell us as a school district that we would carry over 9% a year from this point on, we'd be very happy about that. We would be very satisfied with a 9% fund balance. But here's what's important. If we do not receive additional dollars of state revenue, we will, unless we make drastic cuts to staff this spring, we will see our fund balance drop to $1.2 million, or 4%. We have had lots of discussions with our board, and they are willing to go into next school year without a reduction in force. But if this time next year, if we don't receive significant additional dollars, we're looking at deep cuts in the education program that we have in the Ponca City Public Schools. So we're at a critical juncture, because if we don't receive any new dollars this year and our fund balance drops to 4%, then we'll have to make cuts for fiscal year 15 just to get us back to 8%, which is what the board has asked us to carry over. So it's important that we get more dollars. Now, the next slide shows you where we are right now for funding requests for next year. There seems to be a consensus in the legislature that common education will receive a funding boost somewhere between $75 and $100 million. Now, obviously, it depends upon where that money goes. If that money goes into the state aid appropriation and it comes to school districts, and we can spend it in the manner that we want, that means one thing. If that money is divided up and $100 million of it goes, it's divided up between costs like health insurance, professional development for teachers, some of it goes to the State Department of Education, and it doesn't come to our general fund, then we still can find ourselves being forced to dip significantly into our fund balance. The coalition, which is a group of organizations across the state that represent school district interest, Cooperative Council of School Administrators, Oklahoma State School Board Association, United Suburban School Association, and the Organization of Rural Oklahoma Schools, decided last week to request $150 million from the state. One of the things you always try to do when you talk about revenue requests from the state is to discuss where's the money going to come from. The next slide shows you where we believe that money can come from. The state certified in February an increase of $187 million in state appropriations. So they have $187 million more dollars that they can spend this session. 34% of that money, which again is the lowest percentage of state revenue that we've received since 1017 was passed, would be almost $64 million. The 1017 revenue, dedicated revenue, is projected, has been certified, an increase of $34 million. So that's $97 million that if the legislature appropriates the 1017 money and appropriates what is the low percentage of state appropriated dollars that they've sent to public schools since 1992, if they just do that, that's $97 million new dollars for schools. So the question is, where does the other $50 million come from? An historical analysis of the 1017 fund has revealed that typically the 1017 fund grows significantly between what the estimate was in February and what's actually collected for the year in June. Our analysis leads us to believe that the 1017 fund will not grow $34 million in this year. It will actually grow $84 million. And so if we are appropriated all of the 1017 money, then we can easily meet the target of a $150 million increase in revenue for school districts in Oklahoma. The other thing I would say is that in a $5-6 billion budget, I would think the legislature, if they're committed to and they really truly want to fund schools, can find $50 million someplace. Now remember, $150 million is great, but it's a small Band-Aid on a big gash. Even with that $150 million, we're still about $80 million less in revenue to support the schools in our state than we were back in 2009. It's a great start. It would be, very much appreciated. It would give school districts across the state the ability to stabilize their budgets, to somewhat protect their fund balances a little bit more, give the state a chance to grow its economy more, with the hope that maybe when we get to the 2014-15 school year, then maybe we can have a real serious discussion of not only filling the funding loss that we've had, but maybe putting enough money into the state aid formula that for the first time in 6 years, we can give teachers a pay raise that's meaningful. Right now, our competitors, the people that compete with us for teachers and other educational talent in Arkansas, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, are coming into Oklahoma, and they're recruiting some of our best and brightest students. The very simple reason they can do that is because they pay more. And they can offer students something that we can't offer in this state right now because of the financial condition of our school districts and our budgets. This last slide are the two most important people in this discussion: Senator Eddie Fields and Representative Steve Vaughn. These are both good men. Senator Fields is a former school board member, has a wife that teaches. Representative Vaughn's dad had a career in public education. But these men are under a great deal of pressure from lots of different directions, and they hear consistently that there are other things that are more important for the state to invest their money in into our common schools. They need to hear from people. They need to hear from people from Ponca City who believe education should be the #1 priority, funding priority, for the legislature this year. And they need to hear from those of you, especially those of you who were here in the 90s, you voted for 1017 when it was a state question, or you went to the Capitol and maybe you marched in support of reform and funding, that when you did that, your intention was that the state would never reduce its general fund commitment to the schools of this state and use 1017 money to supplant that. What I consistently hear at the legislature is that they never hear from citizens and they never hear from parents about the needs of their schools, and because all they hear from are superintendents. And what I've told them before is that that's because parents and citizens expect the legislature to do the right thing. When the governor and other elected officials campaign and tell us that common education, that education is the #1 priority, we believe that that should be reflected in their budgets, and we expect them to do that. We don't expect them to move money around. We don't anticipate that they're not going to keep 100% of their promise. And so we have to let them know that. We have to, I think, let them know that a tax cut that gives most of the citizens of Ponca City $38 a year, but takes several hundred thousand or even $1 million out of our school system to educate our kids, isn't a good trade. Doesn't make sense. We may need to reform the tax structure in Oklahoma, and that reform may lead to an elimination of the income tax. But whatever we do, we have to do it in such a way that we can continue to support our educational needs. And the reality is this, everything today costs more, or at least as much as it cost in 2009. We can't continue to operate our school system with less money than we had 4 years ago. It would be hard to operate our school system with the same amount of money that we had 4 years ago because of increased cost. They need to hear that from you. Now, there may be some of you who are watching this, and maybe you're happy that education spending is 20% less. There are some out there who believe that we need to shrink the size of government in Oklahoma. Since common education gets a larger percentage of the budget than any other state agency, the only way you're really going to shrink government in Oklahoma is to shrink your commitment to public schools. And again, you have the right to have that opinion, and you have the right to call these two men and let them know that you think that what's happening right now is really good. And you have a right to do that, and if that's your opinion, I would encourage you to do that. One thing you're going to be told if you talk to Senator Fields and Representative Vaughn is that they don't have any say over the budget, that budget negotiations take place between the governor's office, the president pro tem of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House. And that's absolutely true. Historically, those three individuals get together, they decide a budget, they bring it back to the chambers and basically tell the membership, this is what you've got, and you need to either vote it up or vote it down. What I would tell you is while they may not get to sit in those discussions, the President pro tem of the Senate is elected by Senate membership. The Speaker of the House is elected by House membership. I would assume that if the Speaker of the House is asking House members to do something that they believe is unpopular in their home districts and is going to cause them a great deal of criticism and is going to have people question the job they're doing, then my assumption is they would instruct the Speaker to maybe toughen up his negotiations. What's important is that Representative Vaughn and Eddie Fields, Senator Fields, hear from their constituents that it's not enough to give lip service to public schools. That education, that funding for common education is important, and it should be the first job they take care of this session. Again, I thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. If you're interested in the Parent Legislative Action Committee, if you would call our office at 580-767-8000 and talk to Mary Ladd or Betty Johnson, they will add you to our parent contact list, and we'll make sure that the next time that the Parent Legislative Action Committee meets, that you will receive an invitation to that meeting. Again, thank you for your time.